Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Well, with your weird background, what is that?
It's sorry, mind blank. It's South India, Sri Rangam.
Very good. Very
Lots
good.
of beautiful old ancient temples there. Let's get my
Yeah,
focus working.
nice.
So today I've got David Papineau on, a well-known atheist philosopher. He's written widely and educated on philosophy. One of his books that was highly recommended by a friend is your book, Introduction to Philosophy. What was it called?
I edited a book called Philosophy with various other people contributing articles on, I don't know, metaphysics, ethics, and so on. But I'm not sure I got an introduction. I've got a little kind of primer called Philosophical Devices.
I think that's the one. Yeah, it's quite short. Yeah. Someone, a friend was saying it's better than that one by William Lane Craig as far as an introduction to philosophy goes. Philosophical Foundations for Christian Worldview. He said, I wish I found this one first.
All right. So, but you said I'm an atheist philosopher. I mean, it's true that I'm an atheist and a philosopher, but I don't really work in the philosophy of religion, and I haven't especially argued for atheism in my professional work. But that's fine.
You've argued for materialism, which is...
Yes. Oh, yes.
I mean, if you establish materialism, you've basically established atheism.
That's fine, but yeah.
But I see what you mean. Philosophy of religion is another department. You've focused on, I guess it would be metaphysics?
Yeah, but it's not so much that I'm not worried about departmental divisions, but my interest in materialism wasn't especially to refute atheism. That wasn't I mean, to refute theism. That really wasn't part of my project. It was just to establish materialism against philosophers who might be atheists but would be dualists or pluralists or something like that.
I think that brings up a distinction I like to make between philosophical atheism or philosophical thinkers, as opposed to what you might call an apologist or an internet atheist or an internet. You get the same categories in religious camps and theist camps. So you could have someone who's a philosopher first, and they follow the truth wherever it leads, and they happen to end up as an atheist or a Christian or whatever it is. Or you could have someone who's a Christian or an atheist first, and they use whatever arguments they can wrangle in order to establish or make a case for their existing views.
Right. So you call the second apologists?
I think you could definitely describe some atheists as apologists for atheism.
Yeah. I don't think it should make a difference to the arguments. No, you make.
Oh no! I just like that. There's people like yourself and Graham Oppie and many other less well-known and less prominent or academic qualified people who are thoughtful. Like we had Ben Watkins on recently. He's incredibly thoughtful atheist, and he just loves the ideas. If people can disagree with him, and he thinks that's cool and loves hearing the disagreements. Whereas the atheist apologists, they think you're stupid if you're if you're religious.
Yeah.
Well, you said.
I'm just interested in argument. I mean, perhaps I should be up front. I mean, I had no kind of religious upbringing. I have no religious inclinations. I find it strange that people are attracted to religion.
Right.
I've never found it something important to me to try and refute religion. I just regard it as a kind of remark-worthy corollary of the work I do, and sometimes it comes up, and I'll say, I think I've got good arguments disproving religious ideas, but it wasn't the aim of my work to end up in that position.
But that makes for fruitful discussion, that kind of love of ideas and interest and stuff, whereas the apologist stuff of just trying to prove everyone else wrong, those people aren't worth talking to. Maybe we can get into some of the arguments. I've had you on the channel a couple of times, and I've had lots to say, but I've been in the back seat. First of all, it's a great honor to be talking to someone of your caliber. You're very kind to share your time with me. So you one of the things you argue against is dualism, Well, I know we had a Kandidi on, and he makes the case that it's not a kind of dualism. I don't personally fully understand how it's not dualism. And I also don't see why dualism is something to be avoided. I personally haven't seen any bad arguments against dualism. And even if we can't understand how two distinctly different things can interact, we can still know that they are interacting. Stephen M. Barr gives the example of in science we have electromagnetic fields, which are distinctly different things from electrons, and yet they interact. So we don't really understand how it is that they interact, but we know that they are interacting. So, yeah, do you have any comments on this with regard to the mind-body problem and dualism?
That's interesting. And we can talk about it. And I'd quite like to talk about it quite a lot. But let me just digress momentarily before that. So, what you just said suggests that you're happy with, if not committed to, dualism. But I mean, right? So there's the three options. There's kind of physicalism, there's dualism, and then there's idealism, which is again monist view, but everything is mind rather than everything is matter. And not knowing about your religious views, I would have guessed that you were more inclined towards idealism than dualism. So where do you stand on that three-way choice?
This is probably something I should have studied more, or at least I should get into it. Which, like, I definitely think there's a dualist aspect, because on the Hare Krishna ontology we talk about the soul being different from the body, and matter being something that's prone to destruction, whereas the soul's indestructible. So it does seem that there's two distinctly different things. Although it is also described that everything is Krishna's energy, so everything's God's energy. So there is a kind of monism in a sense, but there's a big focus on there being different kinds of energy and variety and distinction. As for idealism, I think there's perhaps a variety of different kinds of idealism. I'd always thought of idealism as, everything's a mental concoction and there's not a real world outside there. Or, maybe we're all thoughts in God's mind or something, but I'm very much interested in preserving there being something real out there that we're all interacting with. And I think some kinds of idealism preserve that by saying, yeah, there is something out there that we're all interacting with. It's just the nature of it is more mind substance rather than physical substance.
Yeah, that's good. So we might come back to this, but let's put it to one side, because you're right. Any serious idealism needs to somehow account for or recover the pretty obviously apparent distinction between mind and matter. I mean, we in everyday thinking we know there's physical object, there's a material world, and then there's people with minds, and somehow an idealist has to explain what that distinction comes to within their own metaphysical framework. So we can all talk about the mind matter interaction. Okay, back to the question and analogy you had between electromagnetic fields and electrons. Yes, there's some traditional arguments against dualism. Perhaps traditional arguments against Descartes, to the effect that we can't make sense of how mind and matter would interact, that it's somehow they're so different so they can't interact, and your response is, well, I mean, explanation has to stop somewhere. I mean, we've got to accept some basic things like the operation of electromagnetism. Why not just accept that mind and matter interact? After all, we've got plenty of evidence to suppose that they do, even if we can't.
Oh, I've lost your audio.
Okay.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know if you can remember where you were and carry on.
Okay, but let's work it out, because so we haven't started yet. I mean, you're going to have to edit anyway. So
I'll edit together what we got at the last bit.
Let's figure out where we were before we get back into character.
Okay, so you were commenting on the point I made about how even if we can't understand how it works, we can know that it's happening.
Okay, so I will cut back to the beginning of that discussion. So as I see it, the modern argument for materialism against dualism is rather different from the traditional argument, which it sounded like you had in mind, where the traditional argument is that we can't really make sense of two such different things as mind and matter as thought of by dualism interacting. And I mean, people argued against Descartes like that. If these things are so different, if matter is in time and space, but mind is only in time, but not in space, how can two such different things interact? And so Descartes, your dualism doesn't make sense. I agree that's not a very strong argument. And your thought that, look, there's going to be some things at the bottom of science that we just accept, that's how it works, and we don't have any further explanation for it. Think about how basic force fields work. And I agree. And I don't think that's a very strong argument against dualism. And in fact, I think historically, it wasn't very effective. If we look at the history of dualism in Western scientifically informed thought over the last 4 centuries or so, you'll find plenty of interactive dualists, people who thought mind and matter are separate, but nevertheless interact. And they didn't have any big problems with this kind of, they're so different, how can they interact argument. I think the modern argument is very different. It's not the argument that mind and matter can't interact. It's rather an argument from modern science that tells us that they don't interact unless, that is, mind is really part of the physical world. It tells us that things that aren't physical don't, as it happens, as a matter of empirical fact, interact with the physical world. It's not the thought that they can't interact, it's that we have evidence that they don't interact. And so the only way for us to respect the thought, which is obviously true, that what happens in my mind affects what happens in my body, is to suppose my mind is itself part of the physical world. So the driving thought here is the modern scientific discovery that only physical things affect what happened in the physical world. And so it's not an argument of principle, it's an argument for empirical fact.
Right, yeah, so maybe it would be useful to talk about some of that evidence. But first of all, it's not the fact that, the comparison to things at the bottom of science which we can't understand, but we know are the case. That's not the only thing I'd say in defense of dualism. The other things I'd say are there can be two distinctly different things which are sister energies. They're designed to interact. They're compatible with one another. They complement one another. So the fact that they're distinctly different or categorically different doesn't in any way suggest that they should not interact at all. But then, as for the evidence, I would say, especially in neuroscience, we've got a lot of evidence to suggest there's other things entering in. Like, I could go through a short list, and if any of them are interesting, we could go further. But like when people have obsessive compulsive disorders, a useful treatment for that is to teach them that that's just their brain doing something and they can ignore it. And this separating the identity, the understanding, a kind of identity separate from the physical mind helps people ignore what their brain's doing and reprogram it and break out of these unhealthy habits. Or I'm sure you have things to say to these, but I'll just throw a couple of them out there to give us some interesting things to think about. Or like another one is the I think it was Wilder Penfield did a lot of experiments, and he had like open brain surgery and stimulating different parts of the brain, and he could make someone move their arm or different things like this, and he would also ask the patient to voluntarily do muscle actions, and he could never trigger a sense of voluntary action. Every time he made their arm move, they would say, "No, you did that." And every time they chose to move their arm, and there was no way they could know that he was stimulating their brain because there's no sensation inside the brain and they couldn't see what he was doing. And another one is the time that it takes for the brain to process visual images is half a second delayed over how long it takes the brain to process audio. So if we want to preserve a sense that we are the brain, then we've got to explain the fact that we experience sound and images simultaneously. So the fact to just do that, you might want to say, oh, the brain just waits. It gets the sound ready, and then it waits for the audio, for the images to come, and then it combines them later. But the consequences are that we are passive observers, that we're just watching a movie and we're not actually engaging.
Hang on. Okay. You give us three examples, and they're all very interesting cases, but I think they're explainable in materialist terms. But let's just step back a bit, because I mean, the reason I have that reaction to those cases is that I think there's overwhelming evidence of a general sort that what's going on in all those cases must be explainable in materialist terms. And let's look at the general arguments. And I mean, philosophers tend to put the crucial idea here, which I'm going to say is supported by scientific evidence, as the causal closure of the physical. And this is the idea that maybe you have some physical effect, some bit of your body moving, your arms moving, or various neural processes in your brain. They're always fully explicable in terms of prior physical causes. And in the end, they're going to be the three or four fundamental forces recognized by physics, and gravity, electromagnetism, weak nuclear force, strong nuclear force. And why do we think that? Why do we think that all physical processes are governed by just those forces? If you look back in science 100 years, 150 years, you'll find that scientists didn't have this view. They thought there was a far wider range of forces. They thought there were distinctive vital forces and distinctive nervous forces. There were force fields associated with specifically living bodies, and more particularly nervous forces is associated with sentient and intelligent organisms. And they thought they influenced the motion of matter. There was some add some more forces to the four basic forces. And middle of the 19th century, scientists, for many reasons, became convinced that all motions of matter and forces obeyed the conservation of energy. But many of them still thought, well, so that shows that vital and mental forces obey the conservation of energy. They still believed in them. I mean, the fact they obey the conservation of energy might put constraints on how they operate and might make you worry about free will and so on. But still, I mean, well into the 20th century, many scientists were convinced that there were nervous forces, that there was a nervous force field, that nervous energy, our familiar phrase, is the potential energy of the nervous force field, that when you're deliberating, you build up the potential energy of your nervous force field, you're full of nervous energy, you're ready to go, and then when the time for action comes, it's released into kinetic energy. And the question you want to ask is why did people stop believing that? I mean, quite late into the 20th century. And I think the answer was that they discovered more and more about how the brain works, and they came to the view that there's no evidence to suppose that there's anything operating there apart from the basic forces are paradigmatically chemical and electrical processes governed by the electromagnetic force fields. And I mean, the figuring out the operation of nerve cells by Huxley and Hodgkin in 1950s, I think was a crucial step here. I mean, that kind of finally persuaded people that there weren't nothing going on in the brain apart from all the basic physical forces. So that's the background. I mean, and if there were bits of matter, being guided in the brain by things other than the fundamental forces. Scientists should be going to study this and showing that such things are going on. I mean, they win a Nobel Prize straight away. I mean, but all the scientists have become convinced by the evidence and the more and more detailed understanding of the biochemistry going on within cells that it's all explicable in familiar electrical and chemical terms. I mean, really, if you thought there were things going on in the brain that weren't so explicable, obvious research program, go and study the operation of the brain and show it, and you'd be a world-famous scientist. But nobody studying the operation of the brain thinks that's a sensible project. Okay, now let me come to your three cases.
Sure,
okay,
yeah.
So
I should write down the things I have to say to reply to that, but yeah, I'll let you carry on.
But you chucked in the three cases. Look, the OCD case. OCD can be a very nasty business, and there's all kinds of therapies and cognitive behavioral therapies. And you tell me one good therapy is to persuade people that these impulses they're having is really just their brain doing it. You tell them what to my mind is a fairy tale, but they believe the fairy tale, and that makes them less susceptible to these influences and stops them going to check their taps every 5 minutes when they go out. Well, that's good, but it doesn't persuade me that there's anything going on there. But one bit of their brain is helping them deal with another bit of their brain. You had the Penfield case. Penfield, you can stimulate single neurons in the brain with electrodes, and some of them will, in the motor cortex, no doubt, will make people raise their arm, but it won't feel to those people as if they're acting voluntarily. No, of course, because there's a lot of very interesting neuroscientific research into what gives people a feeling of agency, and there's a number of different dimensions to a feeling of agency. But clearly, more needs to be going on in the brain to give you a feeling of agency than just one neuron in the motor cortex firing. And the integration of the audio and visual signals. Look, I mean, that meant how the brain gets perception and action to work is a serious scientific challenge. I mean, of course. In kind of neuroscientific terms, vision is incredibly slow. It's it takes a good half a second to form a detailed fine acuity image of your surroundings, and yet you can't be acting with a half-second delay all the time. So something clever is going on that. Your brain kind of coordinates visual information and action in a way that doesn't give you kind of these temporal glitches. But that's a scientific challenge. People need to work out how the brain is doing it, and to tell the scientists, don't worry about how the brain is doing it. There's this extra mind stuffy thing that's doing all the coordination. They would regard that as just a complete cop out. I mean, you still got to figure out how the brain is doing it. Yeah.
I'd be interested to see what the rates are of physicalism versus some kind of supernatural or dualist worldview among neuroscientists who work with brain patients. Because, I mean, I've had Michael Egner on, you've discussed with him, and he talks about various other, like Wilder Penfield and other neuroscientists who, through their career, have changed their views based on what they've seen from the brain. Like another interesting example is coma patients, how they can speak to them and measure brain activity, but there's no reason to think that their auditory system would be working because of the vegetable state they're in. However, when they I can't remember what the exact things they were do, but basically there's a distinction between abstract and other things. Or I think math is abstract. So when they can give them a math problem, and then like a simple one that anyone could understand, and give them the solution, and their brain fires differently when they give them the correct solution to the math problem, which suggests that there's still something going on there, even though there's no reason to think the physical brain's capable of that. So yeah, I'm just saying I'd be interested to see what among neuroscientists, it'd be interesting if someone did a census to see what it is. Philosophers do armchair stuff, but people who are actually out there in the trenches working with brains, what percentage of them believe in physicalism? Be cool to see.
Well, I mean, I would guess 99.999%. I mean, I spend a lot of time talking to practicing neuroscientists. I've never heard one even so much as half suggest that the solution to any of the kind of we're talking about would be to posit some non-physical processes. And it's very striking. I mean, there's huge amounts of research money available, especially by the Templeton Foundation, for philosophical scientific initiatives that might be sympathetic to religion. And many philosophers and scientists I know have got Templeton grants and developed their research programs with the help of Templeton. But I don't know of any neuroscientists who've used this to push forward some dualist research program in neuroscience. It's not like the money isn't available there to support them. It's just that no serious neuroscientist would be interested in that. It's just not a goer.
I mentioned two already. There's Michael Ignor, who you've spoken to, and Wilder Penfold, who's written on the subject. So there's at least two of them.
No, it just curious me.
Mark Symes too, actually.
Yeah, no, but I'm just saying, I'm very interested in all the kinds of things you're talking about. I'm very much involved with neuroscientists who work on them. I've never met anybody who takes a dualist line, and maybe I'm moving in a wrong circle.
You met Michael Ignor online.
Yes. He's a doctor, isn't he?
He does brain surgery.
Look, clearly there are some people who are qualified as scientists who would agree with you. I'm just saying, in my circles, which are pretty extensive, I've never come across anybody like that.
It'd be cool if there was a census done. Like maybe you get a filtered sample because of the kind of work you do and views you have and who you attract into your.
Look, Arjuna, we could debate this.
No, I'm not debating. I'm just saying it's an interesting question. It'd be nice to have some.
I don't think this is the interesting issue. We're not arguing from sociology. We're arguing from reason and data, I hope.
So on the points you were making earlier, I'll get to the main pushback I would have on the argument you gave for causal closure. But first, I just want to say some defenses of these other ideas. So, of course, there's going to be naive speculative theories that get discarded as science progresses. But it might be the case that we could find an ancient wisdom text that has a reasonable interpretation of hasn't needed to have retreating definitions, and we could still say, oh, this makes sense in light of modern science. I think we can do that with the Hare Krishna scriptures. Akandani's done a bit of work in that area. But also, I think with regard to traditional metaphysical views, we need to give them credit because, for example, traditional Chinese medicine has all this stuff about energy centers in the body and all sorts of stuff. And based on those theories, they do acupuncture therapy. And this all sounds highly speculative. Modern science can't really explain how it works. But in New Zealand, you can get ACC government subsidies, which will pay for you to go and get acupuncture as treatment for recovery from an injury. So it works to such a degree that the government is prepared to spend money for those therapies. So I'm just saying we can't just fully throw question them and be skeptical of them because we need to give them a little bit of credit for their ability.
There's two issues here. I mean, I have no doubt that many therapies that are associated with, or perhaps even inspired by, certain kinds of non-materialistic theories are effective, that they work. I mean, I don't know if the therapists who tell the OCD sufferers that it's only your physical brain, but there's this other bit of brain other bit of mind that we're going to kind of get activated, whether they really believe that. But uh, uh, I'm perfectly prepared to hold that persuading people to embrace that idea can help them with their OCD. Why should I deny that? So of course the therapies might be good. Whether that supports the underlying metaphysics is a different question, and the question there is whether the underlying metaphysics is a better explanation of the success of the theories than materialism, and that depends on the power and cogency of those underlying metaphysics. I mean, if you could give me more detailed evidence, more predictive evidence from Chinese traditional metaphysics, I'd be persuaded. But I don't think just the success of particular therapies is going to be enough.
No, yeah, I'm not throwing it out there as a proof of anything. I'm not trying to bring you over to our camp. I'm just saying it's credit in their favor, the fact that these therapies are beneficial. It's not proof of the worldview which inspired them, but I'm saying we can't just brush them off because modern science is so readily based on the fact that the therapies work.
No, the fact they inspired them is not itself evidence in their favor. What would be evidence in their favor is that they offer better explanations of the therapies than materialist explanations, and that's a further question from just there being the inspiration for the therapies.
Well,
but I mean, I mean that itself is a specific question. I mean, can Western medicine do anything to explain the success of acupuncture? It's not obvious it can, but we need to look at the details. But it's perfectly possible that Western medicine could explain it much better than Chinese.
It's hypothetically possible, or it's in principle possible that there's a materialistic explanation for why acupuncture or any other traditional worldview inspired therapy works. However, I think based on the tools that modern science currently has at its disposal, I don't think there's currently an explanation for why acupuncture works. Somebody out there may have one, and I just haven't studied it. But neither of us are well read on the subject, so we can just.
I mean, you're right. I mean, look, there's plenty of things that clearly work that established.
TCM has an explanation for why it works, but you also get the problem that traditional Chinese medicine works. I would say Ayurveda done well also works. And both of those traditional worldviews contradict one another. So we can't say the fact that they work is proof of the worldview, because then we would end up with contradictions.
So, I mean, look, no, clearly, I mean, there's a fact of the matter about the metaphysics, and the question is which metaphysics is better supported by the evidence.
But coming to the main point, that was just the side point I wanted to make. But so you were saying causal closure. Basically, modern science has explained so many things. It's always explained those things using the physical world. It never brings in energy from outside to explain things. I would fully agree with that. Where I push back is I would say that in terms of energy and forces. But I don't think matter or any kind of physical system provides us with a full explanation of which outcome takes place. So there's always probabilities involved. And in selecting between probabilities, there's no evidence in science that suggests that the intentions of an agent, of a conscious agent separate from the physical system, aren't at play.
I don't think bringing in, I mean, you're quite right that fundamental physics as, under orthodox understandings, says that many outcomes, many physical outcomes, whether this molecular bond is going to break and so on, is purely probabilistic matter. But I think it's a mistake to think that therefore kind of makes space, opens a gap for a non-physical independent mind to make a difference. And the point here is that while quantum mechanics only makes probabilistic predictions, it does still hold that there's always a physical explanation for certain results having the probability that they do. right? So we have some radium atom. Is it radioactive atom? Is it going to split? We have some molecular bond in the brain. Is it going to break? And quantum mechanics says, given the physical circumstances, there's a 75% chance it will break. And if you say, but I think that if some mind maybe makes a decision to turn left rather than right, that's going to change the probability that the molecular bond breaks, then that's contradicting quantum physics. Quantum physics says that probability is fixed by the prior physical circumstances. And the thought that a mind can make a difference to the probability is then denying what quantum mechanics says. And indeed, just as before, you would win a Nobel Prize if you could go into the laboratory and show that in a brain, the quantum mechanics predictions are inaccurate when we have some subject deciding to go left rather than right, then you get a Nobel Prize. And I'm kind of arguing from the authority of current scientific opinion, but still, I'm making the point that current scientific opinion does not leave room for an independent mind to alter the probability of quantum results.
So you're talking about these probabilistic laws, but isn't it the case that these laws are simply the product of what has been observed when people have gone out and measured? They're experimental results, not laws that can't be strayed from.
Look, quantum mechanics what metaphysical account of the world it's giving us is a very puzzling thing. It's very strange. I myself favor the Everettian understanding of quantum mechanics, in which the universe is splitting all the time. It's not the whole universe is splitting, but there's all kinds of branching going on in reality. So the alternative futures, if you turn left or right, depending on whether this molecule breaks, and it's a quantum thing, there's a part of reality in which you turn left, another part of reality in which you turn right. That's my view of the right way to understand what quantum mechanics is telling us, which is pretty weird stuff. But
that's definitely a radical view.
Well,
I mean, I know there's many physicists who hold that view, but it's far out.
Yeah, I mean, many physicists and philosophers endorse it, but it's, I wouldn't say that's the majority view at all. But the view you expressed is a view which is probably pretty common among physicists, and was the orthodoxy through the 20th century, largely under the influence of Bohr. And I regard that as an indefensible view. So that's the view that it's all too puzzling, it's all too mysterious. We should settle for believing the implications of quantum mechanics for what we observe, the patterns in the experiments, and as to what's really going on in reality at a microscopic level, we should throw up our hands. And that was kind of the orthodox view of physicists working in this area. I mean, the mantra, I think it's no. In fact, nobody's quite sure who this mantra is due to. When the physics student says, "I can't make sense of what this theory is telling us about reality," and the professor says, "Shut up and calculate," and the students, because it's not natural for physicists to have kind of philosophical worries about the underlying nature of reality, they're told, "Don't worry about that. Just go ahead and churn out the predictions." But it's a failure of philosophical seriousness to say, I'm not going to worry about the nature of reality because it's such a hard thing, and my training as a physicist doesn't encourage me engage with that. I think anybody who's serious about understanding quantum mechanics has to try and figure out what it's telling us about the nature of reality. I mean, and among serious people, there's a pile of competing alternatives. In my circles, it's pretty cut and dried. There's three big options. You're a collapse theorist. GRW theory is the current standard version of that, and that's that reality does somehow redefine itself when we have quantum observations. It goes from certain results being probable to certain results being definite in a otherwise ununderstandable way. And then there's the Bohmian theory that has hidden variables and thinks there definitely are particles all the time, even before the measurements. And then there's the Everettian theory, which I favor. It's far simpler than other theories, and in particular, it's consistent with relativity theory, which other two theories struggle with. And so that's the main argument for the many worlds. It's the only interpretation of quantum mechanics that's consistent with relativity theory. But I grant you, it's not that most physicists would sign up to that. But most physicists who worry about the underlying, well, most is perhaps a bit strong, but many physicists worry about the underlying nature of quantum reality do sign up to it.
What's the view which I presented called?
The view you presented is a cop-out. It's called instrumentalism. It's called, well, you can run it two ways. You can say there isn't any microscopic reality behind the observable world. There's just the observable world, and all this stuff about quantum wave functions and so on. That's all just a calculating device. We shouldn't take it seriously as to telling us about the underlying reality. Or you can have a pretty similar view. Look, there is some underlying reality, but we're in no position to know about it, and so we've just got to settle for looking at the observable implications of the theory. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of philosophical terms for that attitude. Instrumentalism is the most familiar. Scientific theories are just instruments for generating predictions and shouldn't be taken seriously as telling about underlying reality. People talk about constructive empiricism or skeptical.
Instrumentalism would be a kind of agnosticism, that scientific theories can be useful, they can give us predictions, but we can't ultimately use science to understand the real metaphysics underlying the phenomenological world we experience.
Good. No, the best kind of instrumentalism is agnosticism, but there are also what in my business are called atheistic instrumentalists who go further and say there isn't an underlying reality, there's just the observable world. And maybe they back that up with arguments to say, look, the whole idea of an unobservable reality doesn't make sense, or the idea of us forming a conception of unobservable reality is a confusion. But right, so the atheistic instrumentalists as well. But in fact, it's pretty hard to be an atheistic instrumentalist because you're putting so much weight on the distinction between what's observable and what's not observable in your construction of reality. So it's a much more cogent position to be an agnostic instrumentalist and say there's certain things that we have pretty direct contact with and we know about them, and how reality is beyond that is just a matter of speculation and we shouldn't take it too seriously. And I mean that's yeah. I mean, there's quite a lot of serious philosophers and scientists who adopt that view.
I think you touched on the view I hold quite well there, which is I've heard it called phenomenological. Forgetting how the words. Teleological phenomenology. So the world is intended to deliver sensory experiences to living entities, to us. That's the prime reality. So the painting is the thing that the art historian tells you about. Whereas the paint chemist who talks about all the underlying physics of the chemistry going on in the canvas, who's reducing it all, that's not the true story. The true story is this teleological phenomenon. We experience the phenomenology, but it's teleological. It's intended for us to experience this way first and foremost, and then the physics is worked backwards from there. So I think of the laws of physics. I think of it as an algorithm which determines what experiences to deliver to us. So we get certain reactions based on certain activity, and matter is an algorithm which determines those.
There are, well, that sounds more like, we don't want to get our metaphors too muddled up, but when I was distinguishing, not thinking about religion, but attitudes to science and scientific theories, we used the useful shorthand of agnosticism and atheism, nothing to do with religion, to distinguish the instrumentalists who said, our knowledge can only go so far, and behind that there's a reality, but we're not very good at finding out about it. That's the agnostic instrumentalist. And then there's the atheistic instrumentalist who says the only real reality is the observable reality, and the idea of some further reality made of atoms and wave functions and so on behind that shouldn't be taken seriously at all. That's muddling it up with the. There's no such thing. There's nothing there, and the view that say there's some higher power who is delivering sensory experience to us, not via creating atoms and so on, just delivering it to us straight. For some reason, the sensory experience is in fact sensory experience that naturally leads us to think there must be atoms. But the views, I mean, I don't know, Berkeleian view, views that reality is exhausted by the sense experiences that God gives us. That's mixing our metaphors again, atheistic instrumentalism. And the trouble with that view, if you ask me, next to the trouble with agnostic instrumentalism too, is that if you think about quantum mechanics, it becomes quite tempting to be an instrumentalist, because quantum mechanics, it's so hard to see what it's telling us about the nature of underlying reality. But there's other areas of science which also have commitments to the nature of underlying reality, where I regard it as just ignorant, uneducated to be any kind of instrumentalist. I mean, take atomic theory, that matter at low energies is constituted by atoms, one kind for each element, combined in simple whole number ratios, intermolecules. I mean, the whole atomic theory that came into focus in the middle of the 19th century. I mean, if you know the evidence, all the evidence, which is overwhelming amounts of evidence, you would be crazy to deny that reality is such that matter is really made of atoms. So when we look at well-established parts of scientific theory, the attraction of instrumentalism go away. We really do know that matter is made of atoms. We really know how the atoms work and so on. It's not like quantum mechanics.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. Like, I think biological examples are good too. Like the idea that eating certain kinds of food is healthy, and here's the physical explanation we give of why it's good for you and how this kind of fats clogs your arteries. The idea that that's just a theory that has nothing to do with reality, but it's useful to believe it. I think that it's a little bit absurd.
I'll go to atomic theory. No, I think the knockdown. I mean, if you think of biochemical medicine and people's knowledge of DNA and viruses and the structure of viruses and so on, and to suppose that's all just a useful story seems just kind of crazy.
Well, I think anything where the results, like we can say, here's our theory, I'm going to build this bridge and it won't fall over. You build the bridge, you build thousands of them and they don't fall over. And when they do fall over, you have a full explanation why they fell over. Anything you can do that with, or, chemistry and health and so on, and pharmacology, then I think the explanation of why that's working has a lot of proof behind it. But when you have a theory that it's like 50% of the time your predictive results come true and 50% of the time you got no idea what's going on, then I think we've got to question those theories. But another point I'd make is I think there's limits to our intuition. So like this comes to something I was thinking about when I converted your book to audio and have AI reading it to you. So I was listening to it today in preparation, and you're talking about set theories. And well, yeah, I guess this is kind of unrelated, but I can quickly touch on it since I brought it up, even though it's a tangent. Talking about self-referential sets, the barber who cuts the hair of all people who don't cut their own hair. We can do weird things with self-referential statements. I think that's all we take away from that. And philosophers, of course, spend a huge amount of time discussing what are the implications of that. And I think that's unrelated, actually. What I was getting at is people talk about infinities and Kalam cosmological arguments, and whether there's causal finitism or where you can have an infinite causal chain, or whether we could have an infinite origin or an infinite future and all this stuff. And I just think that our ability to reason is restricted to things we have everyday experience of. So when we have everyday experience of something, we can accurately reason about that. But when it comes to infinities and some of these other big questions in physics and philosophy, our ability to reason and have intuitions about the subject becomes limited, and we need to have some epistemic humility.
Yes. I mean, there's areas of mathematics that get pretty weird and wonderful, but and I'm not sure what my epistemic attitude towards them is. I'm not familiar enough with them, but I resist the idea that we need to start being epistemically humble as soon as we engage with infinities.
I think our ability to have certainty. So if you say, here's a knockdown philosophical proof, here's a syllogism that conclusively proves a statement. I think when it's something about dealing with infinities or things we have no experience of, I don't think we can say we have knockdown proof. I think we can say this is interesting and maybe it gives us reason to believe this, but I don't think we can say everyone who disagrees with us is unreasonable.
Let's take a simple example. So take the natural numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, and take the even natural numbers and take the thought that those two sequences can be put into a one-to-one correspondence with each other. So you pair 0 with 0, and you pair 1 from the natural numbers with 2 from the even natural numbers, and you pair 2 from the natural numbers with 4 from the even natural numbers. So you can see that for every natural number, there's an even natural number, and for every even natural number, there's an ordinary natural number, and none of them are paired with 2 of the other. And I don't see there's any holes in that bit of reasoning. And so in the sense of, can they be put into one-to-one correspondence? It's the same number of natural numbers as even natural numbers. I don't feel any insecurity about that bit of reasoning. I feel absolutely certain that the natural numbers and even natural numbers can be put into one-to-one correspondence.
Yeah, but when it comes to what was that mathematician who did all the infinite stuff, and Hilbert's Hotel and stuff like that, and you do weird things with infinities when you do them in math. And or like
look, I mean, that's a bit of weirdness I just gave you. Look, there's a sense in which there's as many even natural numbers as there are natural numbers, and I just explained why that's so.
Yeah,
but there's also another sense in which there's clearly more natural numbers than the even natural numbers. Even natural numbers are a proper subset of the natural numbers. The even natural numbers don't include quite a lot of natural numbers. They don't include all the odd ones. So I mean, right. So there's a kind of weirdness that the natural numbers are both the same size. I mean, the even natural numbers are both the same size as the natural numbers, but fewer than them. But it's not a contradiction. There's just two senses of more than in play here. And I mean,
so there's
somebody
different
might
sizes of infinity. Is that like the same thing as
different sizes of infinity is a yet further thought. And I didn't use that as the example of a bit of reasoning with infinities, which is absolutely straightforward and no room for uncertainty, because people do have some doubts about whether the real numbers are really a higher order of cardinality than the natural numbers. I mean, it's pretty fringy to doubt it, but it can be doubted, and serious people do sometimes doubt it. But the thing that I just gave you with the even natural numbers are of the same size as the natural numbers, even though they're a subpart of them, nobody has any doubts about that.
Doesn't that mean there's two sizes of infinities? There's the size of infinities, which is all the even numbers, and then there's a larger infinity, which is all the natural numbers.
No, the even numbers and natural numbers are the same size of infinity. They both are Aleph naught, they're both denumerable. And the oddity, such as it is just that while they're the same order of infinity, the same size, they have the same cardinality, there's in the sense of as many even natural numbers as natural numbers. The oddity is, at the same time, the even natural numbers are just part of the natural numbers. They're a proper subset of them. But it's not different orders of infinity. It's the contradiction between being a subset and being the same numerical size. It's when you get to the real numbers that you get an order of infinity. The real numbers can't be put into one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. They're bigger again. But the natural numbers and the even natural numbers and the rational numbers and the odd natural numbers, they're all the same size. They can all be paired up one-to-one.
Wouldn't they have to be double as many? Sorry,
No,
I just want to ask you a quick question. There's an example you gave.
When you're talking as look, here's the basic idea of two sets being equal in numerical size. You look, here's a bunch of knives and here's a bunch of forks, and are the same number of knives and forks? Here's the one and only definitive test. Can you put each knife next to one fork, each fork next to one knife, such that each knife is paired with one fork and each fork is paired with one knife? And if that's the case, then there's the same number. And it might be 23 of each or 27 of each, but if you can pair them up one-to-one, there must be the same number.
Right.
And when people send that to infinity, you get a notion of two infinite sets being the same number, i.e., they're the same number if they can be paired up one-to-one. And the funny thing about infinite sets is that you can have one infinite set that's a subset of another infinite set. The second includes more members than are in the first. And yet they can still be paired up one-to-one. And in fact, that's the defining characteristic of infinite sets, that a subset of an infinite set can be paired with infinite set.
Is this example you gave similar to if I said, say, Neptune takes 164 years for every, there's 164 Neptune orbits for every Earth orbit. So could if Neptune and Earth had been orbiting the sun for an infinite amount of time, would we then be able to say we can pair up on a one-to-one basis every Neptune orbit to every Earth orbit, to an Earth orbit? Is this the same kind of idea?
Yeah, but
I'm just saying if I'm understanding it. It's just a simple example. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, it's a slightly confusing example, but I mean,
it's simple for me. I've heard it before from William Lane Craig.
That's just to say the multiples of 164 can be paired up one-to-one with the natural numbers. And, yeah. I don't know why we brought in Neptune and Earth, but
it's just a visual example. So
that's fine.
I mean, so you're doing it with a double, and I'm doing it with 164. Obviously, the double is, if you can do it with a double, that still establishes something very significant. But aren't you always having to reach further into the infinity? So, so the odd numbers, you've got half as many. In a finite set, you've got half as many odd numbers as you do natural numbers.
Good.
So, in an infinite set, you're constantly having to reach further towards infinity for to find more odd numbers to pair up with your natural numbers.
Yeah. And so.
So,
I mean, I
agree
with
any chunk of the infinity you take, you're going to have a far larger number of even numbers than. And the further along you go along the chain, the greater the distance between the odd number that you're pairing up with the natural number you're pairing up.
Look,
this would suggest that there's a larger number of them. I'm not qualified to comment on the subject. I'm just, a lay person might relate to my questions here. That's all.
No, that's absolutely fine. There's a perfectly good sense in which there's only half as many even numbers as natural numbers. Well, when I say that, not quite sure how to define that sense, but intuitively you can see it. Yeah. But when you do two sets have the same number if and only if they can be paired up one to one, when you're working with that notion of what's the numerosity of a set, with that notion you don't get there's half as many even numbers as natural numbers. You get it's the same number. And so you just have to distinguish the pairing notion of the same number with the subset notion of the same number, and when you get to infinities, they don't line up together anymore.
So, like William Lane Craig gave this argument using the orbits as an argument for a cosmological argument that there has to be a beginning. It's a logical argument because otherwise Neptune, and he gave different planets as examples. Otherwise, we would have to say that since, historically, because it's an infinite history, Neptune and Earth have orbited the sun precisely the same number of times. And that there's an obvious absurdity contained in that.
I'm just trying to piece together the whole. I mean, sorry. This is supposed to be an argument for time.
Sorry, I don't agree with this as an argument against there being a finite point at which in history. Just as a logical argument, if we say Neptune and Earth at orbit, I don't think that's an argument against it being the case. But it's an interesting thing to think about, though.
Yes, we're thinking about what immediately occurs to me is if you found it worrying that the Earth and Neptune orbit the sun the same number of times, I don't see why the worry would go away if you supposed there was a starting point in time.
Then they would have orbited. Then you would have finite numbers, and there would be a far larger number of Neptune of Earth orbits to every Neptune orbit.
Hang on, but you'd need both a definite start to the universe and a definite finish. I mean, you still have the infinities and the oddity if you had a definite start, and then things went on forever.
Well, I think if you have a finite beginning and an infinite horizon, isn't the philosophical a common philosophical position that infinity is never reached? You can't start at a finite point and never actually reach infinity.
Well, then you could have said that without a start to time. I'm just not seeing whether. Look. The example I gave you, where you have the oddity of a subset having the same number as the set it's a subset of, was the natural numbers that have a natural starting point, 0, and the oddity is still there. So let's not worry about reconstructing.
But the numbers are an infinity that exists simultaneously. So there's no starting from 0. I mean, you can't start counting from 0 and arrive at infinity. At any number, at any point, you'll be counting another finite number, right?
Look, let's move on. I mean, I don't think this is a good argument.
This is off topic, but it's interesting.
I don't find it inconsistent to say they orbit the sun the same number of times, but I
think there's at least intuitively there's absurdity contained in that.
No. Well, just think about the even numbers and natural numbers again.
I find that one odd in the same way. But yeah, I was just
Yeah.
making a point that that I think. I mean, when you say this kind of thing, this that our ability to reason and intuit about subjects is restricted within things we have regular experience of. To people who love to do philosophy about infinities, they say that's interesting, and then they go back to doing their intensive philosophy about infinities. It doesn't really add anything to the debate. The people who find these subjects and debates interesting.
I just don't buy this idea of we can only reason things we have experience of. I mean, that sounds like a very restrictive kind of empiricism, which I'm somewhat surprised to hear you endorsing, of all people. But
why would that be?
Think about molecular biochemistry. I mean, nobody's ever seen an atom or a small biochemical molecule, but it doesn't stop the immunologists, the virologists being able to figure out what's going on with the SARS virus. I mean, they don't have experience of these things that they're manipulating in test tubes, but they should know what they're doing.
We have experience of computer viruses, and the idea of a biological virus and a computer virus, it's a similar sorts of things. We understand information, we understand how information can be corrupted and change how processes run if the information is driving the process.
If you loosen up the idea of having experience of to include things that we don't directly observe but we reason to, well then I'll buy your thought that it's kind of tautological, that we can only.
Yeah, I would put viruses in a different category because it's information affecting structures and activities, and we have regular experience of that. You give someone instructions, if they follow your instructions to the T and you gave the wrong instructions, things don't go well. If they change the instructions or you gave the wrong instructions, things can be better. So altering information can have good or bad results. We have regular experience of that, and the idea that viruses could do this to our biological cells is not so far removed from things we have everyday experience of. I think infinities are something different. I don't know how many other things I would put in that camp, but definitely infinities are things beyond what. So why is it that you would find it surprising coming from me? Because something about a theological worldview.
I was hearing you as saying that we can only reason with things that we have sensory experience of, and I would have thought somebody with theological inclinations felt they had more contact with reality than was just delivered by sense.
Oh yeah, no, I don't just mean sensual. I mean we've got reasoning faculties and intuition, and those can. Yeah. No, I don't just mean in a physical empiricism sense.
Perhaps you should move on.
One thing.
Did you have any specific questions you want to get back to?
So we were talking about quantum theories, and you seem to be quite knowledgeable about this subject. A while ago, I listened to a lot of podcasts and audiobooks and stuff, and I often can't remember where an idea came from. So I heard someone describing a kind of simulation hypothesis based on quantum physics, which is, the double slit experiment, observation changes the way matter behaves. And they were comparing this to how in a video game, there's a physics engine, and the physics engine determines what pixels appear on the screen. And only like a little area outside of where you're looking is going to be rendered at any one time. And the rest of it will just be essentially a probability space until you move along, and then things will render. And they were comparing this to the breakdown of the wave function. I thought that was quite interesting. I'm wondering if you can help me pinpoint where that idea came from, because I like to give people credit, but if you don't know, that's fine. Or you could just comment on the idea.
The idea that the wave function collapses, that a system that's kind of
like rendering in a video game.
A system that's indeterminate in, say, position, and then let's suppose it's an electron, becomes definite in position when an observation is made. That's kind of, I don't know, basic thoughts in the understanding of quantum mechanics, and it went with what I said was the kind of orthodox bullying, shut up and calculate instrumentalism that was done in the 20th century. But part of the reason that that view is no longer taken seriously. So the three serious views I described, GRW collapse theories, Bohmian variable theories, Everettian theories, none of them include that thought really, because there's a question of what's an observation. And if you think an observation is, I don't know, where some small physical system, the electron interacts with a bigger physical system, maybe a photographic plate or something, it's not clear why the original quantum mechanics doesn't apply to the interaction of a little system with a big physical system, which it does. And so you don't really have an observation as something that's distinct. So some fringy people have the idea that it's non-physical consciousness that collapses the wave function. And you can see papers by people like David Chalmers developing this idea in an exploratory way. He doesn't especially endorse it, but it doesn't really work for all kinds of reasons. So the idea that observation in the sense of human conscious observation makes a difference in quantum mechanics isn't an idea that's developed by physicists, but yeah, I mean, you could put that as a forced solution to what's going on when quantum mechanical systems that are indeterminate, some electrons indeterminate position, apparently become determinate. That's the kind of central puzzle of quantum mechanics. What account are we supposed to give of that move from indeterminacy to determinacy? And you could have the view that it happens when the physical world interacts with a separate conscious mind, but it's not a mainstream view by any means.
Yeah, it may not be a mainstream view, but I think there's definitely a few prominent physicists who are favorable to the idea. I can't remember any names. I'm just in a big focus of mine.
Wigner was a
Wigner, that's the one, yeah.
Physicist who explored the idea, but as I said, there's the three orthodox views, and then there's this other view. And what would be the argument against it? Well, it presupposes dualism. There's also the point worth making that it doesn't give you the thing that you wanted earlier. It doesn't give you the thing where the mind is making a difference to what happens, because all the mind does is it collapses the wave function, so the electron, which was indeterminate in position, becomes determinate in position, but the mind does not control where the electron becomes determinate. The mind just says, right, there's a 5% chance it's in each of these 20 regions, and so let's throw the dice and see where it lands. And so the mind kind of goes from its being a 5% chance to it's actually being somewhere or other, but it doesn't tell you which somewhere or other it's going to be. So, yes.
Yeah, I would agree that the consciousness breaking down the wave function, it gets us to consciousness existing separate from matter, but it doesn't get us to our us having an ability to influence reality. But I think it is supportive of a kind of teleological view of reality, like I gave the example of the video game. Also, I wanted to add later, perhaps I wasn't clear, that when I give this teleological phenomenology worldview, I don't mean God's here very intentionally choosing exactly what we experience at any given moment. I mean, God's created a system that determines it, and then he sits back and we interact with that system, and that system is designed with certain purposes in mind.
Okay, I'm going to walk downstairs because I've just seen my battery is very low and I don't want to cut out. But carry on talking. I'm just going to get my charger. I will stay on screen all the time.
Okay. Perhaps I'll come back to. So yeah, this is a good time to move back onto one of the main points I wanted to get to, and it's a direct reply to what you just said about how consciousness, establishing the existence of consciousness based on quantum physics doesn't get us to consciousness influencing reality. However, perhaps you've heard of the Princeton engineering anomalous research studies where the peers research studies where they've used random event generators and got people to, just ordinary people or people who meditate are better at it, to use their intentions in an attempt to sway the results of a random event generator. So they get it so they can see the result. Like they might have a quantum random event generator that produces a line on a screen, and the generic probabilities will have the line sitting here, and their goal is to intentionally try to move the line up. They've even done it with marble machines, and they even found people were able to sway mechanical random event generators. So this seems to show that we can influence quantum processes. And then, of course, that gets into OR theory, which you've probably heard of too, that talks about quantum processes in the brain that affect the probability of a neuron firing. And if our consciousness can affect random events outside of our brain, why couldn't it affect them inside our neurons?
Look, I mean, my view is if you could give me good persuasive evidence that such a thing was happening, I would change my mind. And if this Princeton study was producing that, I would expect to have been told about it, and I would take it seriously. So I'm sorry. I mean, you can quote this data, and I'll go and look it up. But I think that would be world-shattering discovery, and if it were true, of course, we should change our minds. That's my response to that.
Yeah, that's a reasonable response. I mean, a little bit of it is relying on the authority of science. I mean, to give a little bit of background, a lot of people were just really skeptical of what they did, and someone took the same machine they used and tried to replicate it and didn't get the same results, and they said it didn't work. And she went in and just looked, well, tell me what you're doing. And she looked at what they're doing. She said, of course this isn't going to work. And to explain the idea she gave in defense was, if we can, with our intentions, influence quantum processes, then the person conducting the study can, with their intentions of their skepticism that this is going to work, influence the quantum processes to produce exactly what they would expect, were their skepticism true. So the people carrying out the study need to suspend their disbelief genuinely. And I think just like I was saying at the beginning, you get religious people and atheistic people who are very determined in a particular worldview. And they're like, I'm not saying it in like that this shows shade on their character, like they're twisting the results or anything. Just that when we believe something strongly enough, we can sort of carry certain biases and fail to appreciate them, and this influence how much weight we give to some evidence versus other evidence, and that so on.
Yes, I mean, one wonders. I mean, one does often find in the parapsychology community studies that achieve significant results, and they get published. And but one question one has to ask is, I mean, how replicable are they? And this isn't just an issue for the parapsychology community. I mean, we've all heard about the replication crisis in mainstream science, and to my mind, that's largely, I mean, I imagine there's other influences too, but largely a result of the completely misguided enthusiasm of science for significance tests and the idea of p-values. And so the standard scientific principle is, if you get results, which should only happen 5% of the time, if there was no real effect, then you can conclude there is a real effect, because if there wasn't a real effect, you wouldn't have got these results, or you would only have gotten 5% of the time. But if you think about it, the 5% of the time is not 0% of the time. And so scientists go around, let's suppose they spend all their time testing hypotheses which are in fact bogus, and there's no effect of the particular treatment making an effort with your mind to move the line or whatever. And one time in 20, they get the result that is going to happen if there's no effect. And then they publish the paper. And you could imagine that all the papers are published with this 5% significant level are in fact bogus. I mean, it's not a real result. It's only you're only getting all these papers because for every 20 scientists who try and establish a non-existent effect, one gets a significant result by chance. That's what 5% significance means. So, of course, you're going to get parapsychologists coming up with significant results in just the same way you get a lot of orthodox scientists coming up with significant results when in fact there's no effect there. I mean, it's a real problem. So the German chemical company Bayer got worried that so many of their drug development initiatives weren't working out, and they tried to find the root cause of that, and they concluded it was because they were starting from pure research results that were published in non-applied biochemical journals, and thinking, oh, that's very interesting. That looks like we can develop a drug on that basis. It didn't work out. And that's because 70% of the results they were relying on, in fact, were artifacts of significance testing, that in fact there was no real effect there. It was just that some scientists got lucky, or if you look at it the other way around, got unlucky because they became convinced that they had a good result when in fact there was no real effect.
Yeah.
So sorry, that was a little rant about significance tests and replication crisis. And,
no, it's important.
But I put it like that because when I say, sure, the parapsychologist is going to come up with results that aren't replicable, I'm not saying that they're any worse than any other kind of scientists. It's a problem generic to the whole approach to science based on significance testing.
Yeah, I've heard that problem described really well by some other YouTubers. It's like if 1 in 20, if you have a certain result that you'd only expect from 1 in 20 studies, and you only publish studies that have significant results, and 1 in 20 studies that are conducted are published, then all the studies become meaningless.
Absolutely.
I guess the problem would be from, that skeptics often give this argument against people who report miracle claims or other things like, there's always the story of the Christians who were on the side of the road and broken down, and they were missing a nut, and they prayed to God, and a truck drove by and a nut rolled off and it landed right in front of them. And it was the exact right size nut they needed. And that story sounds pretty cool, right? Except we only heard that story. We didn't hear about the 100 other Christians or the thousands of other Christians who were stuck on the side of the road praying, and a nut didn't roll off the truck at that precise moment, right?
So that's reminding me, there's supposed to be famous psychological result. I mean, this is from social psychology, which is the Good Samaritan study. And they tested people. I mean, they probably wouldn't get ethics approval now. I mean, they had experimental subjects, and they sent them off across the campus, and there was somebody writhing in pain by the side of the road. And did they stop? And almost all the variation in whether they stopped or not depended on how much of a hurry they were in, not on whether they were good people or not. So it was kind of situational demonstration that the context makes a difference to your behavior, and your kind of supposed ethical standards make no real difference at all. But I'm not sure whether that result, the Good Samaritan study, is in fact replicable, or whether it's one of the bogus ones where the scientists just got lucky. Because you can imagine a social psychologist design all these experiments to test. And there's all the ones like if you put a picture of eyes on the wall of the room, people will be honest in the honesty box for paying for coffee. And if the judge has just had a hot cup of tea, they're going to be more lenient in their sentences. And an awful lot of these studies have turned out not to be replicable. And one thinks, well, yeah, the social psychologists got lucky. They're doing these studies all the time. And yeah, exactly. One time in 20, they get lucky. So if anybody's interested, I mean, what this is all an argument for is that significance test is a terrible way to do science. And the idea that you can conclude what the significance of some result is independently of your prior idea about how plausible the theory is, that turns out just to be a terrible idea. And if anybody's interested, listening to this, I wrote a paper for the general audience in the Times Literary Supplement. If you Google Papineau and Bayes, Thomas Bayes, B-A-Y-E-S.
We'll put a link in the description.
Yeah. Okay. It's, I can't remember what the thing is called, but it's Thomas Bayes, the Bayesianism as an alternative to significance tests. But the article's kind of about Bayes, but I make it an article about significance tests and the replication crisis as well, and how he's the solution.
I'll check that out. That sounds interesting because it's a serious problem that we need a solution to. Is it too technical to quickly explain now?
Well, I mean, the half the article is about, well, so Bayes' idea is that if you have some prior idea about how likely it is that people will be more inclined to put money in the honesty box if there's eyes on the wall watching them. And then look, statistics is all to do with how likely is it that I spin a coin 4 times, right? And I get 4 heads. And you might think, that shows the coin's heads biased. And okay, there's 2 things you need to know in order to know whether that's a good conclusion to draw. One is, how likely is it that you'll get 4 heads with a fair coin? And we could do that. I think it's 1 in 16, I think. But yeah, that's the kind of thing you get taught in statistics. And the other is, how likely is it that the coin is biased? And that's in a normal world, very, very unlikely. I mean, if you're messing around in a magician's house, it gets much more likely. And the attitude you ought to have to the coin is biased is a function of both those things. It's a function of how likely it is that a fair coin will give you 4 heads, and the less likely that, the more you ought to incline to the coin is biased idea. But it's also a function of how likely it is that the coin you pick up is biased. And Bayesianism is, I mean, on one understanding, is the view that the attitude you have after seeing the data ought to be partly conditioned by the attitude you had before you got the data to how likely it is that a coin that you pick up is biased. As I say, in a magician's house, you might think, well, yeah, it's a reasonable chance, 1 in 10 or something. If it's just a coin you pick up in the street, what's the chance of it's being biased? Very little. Okay, so Bayes says, factor in, before you arrive at your posterior attitude, your posterior probability, what the prior probability was. And significance testing is all a methodology cooked up by scientists who felt that your prior attitudes ought to make no difference in science. That's the whole driving inspiration for significance tests. don't have any prior attitudes. We don't want scientists going around with prior attitudes. Somehow we can ignore that. We just look at how likely is the data given various hypotheses, and that's enough to tell us the attitude to have afterwards.
But we use prior attitudes all the time. Like when we see strange anomalies like autism rates rising along with the sales of organic food, nobody says, let's get rid of our prior reasoning and try to figure out what's going on with organic food and autistic people. Right?
So no serious people. Look, if you talk to serious scientists and you know, there's some striking result in nature, and so do you draw the conclusion? I don't know that mad cow disease is due to protein formation. I mean, I talked to someone. He said, no. Yeah, there's a lot of data, but no, it's just so implausible. It's so implausible that will work. The general profile of the disease doesn't look like, and scientists, when they actually form views, of course they use their prior ideas about how plausible things are, and somebody who went around not doing that would be a real danger to society. But somehow the methodology of significance tests, and you get published if you have a significant result and not otherwise, is somehow an attempt to avoid using prior probabilities. And the replication crisis is the inevitable consequence of the silliness of trying to get around without using prior probabilities. So I mean that's what my article pushes.
Yeah, a really clear example I've heard given of Bayesian reasoning like that is, say you have a test for a particular disease which has a 10% false positive rate.
Yeah, exactly.
So then you test 1,000 people for a disease that only 3 in 1,000 people get. In a given population, only 3 people out of 1,000 will have it. So you then have 100 people that get a false positive, but you take one of them and you think, oh, what's the chance that they actually have a disease? Oh, 90%, 10% false positive, right? But in fact, you've now got 100 people, and only 3 of them have the disease. So the chance that that person now has a disease is actually only 3%.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. We're moving away from mind-brain issues here.
Yeah. Well, I just find lots of these different subjects interesting. But back on the Piers Lab research, how would you apply Bayesian reasoning here? Because it would seem that you just use your priors to say it must be hogwash and not look into it any further.
I said that the posterior view you should have is a function A of your prior views and B of the data. And so, look, I'm in the magician's house. I think, look, there's a 1 in 10 chance a coin is biased, right? And I toss it 10 times, it comes up heads every time. I'm going to, at that stage, my credence, my posterior probability will get very close to 1, even though it started off as 1/10, because the chance of it's coming up heads 10 times on a fair coin is very, very low. Chance of it's coming up heads on a heads biased coin, it depends how biased it is much, much higher. So enough data can make you change your prior attitude to some hypothesis from very, very low to very, very high. I mean, that's what happens in science all the time. I mean, you get more and more data, and the idea that space is bent near to massive bodies, that's pretty dotty. And if somebody had said that to people in 1890, they would have said, no, that's crazy. 1 in a million chance that's true. But you get enough data of light bending near massive bodies, and you're forced to change your mind. So enough data will do it. So when you describe the Princeton study, I didn't say nothing is ever going to persuade me of that.
Yeah.
I actually the opposite reaction. I said, give me enough data, and I'll change my mind. And I still think that.
I guess
so. But enough data is not that you had a 5% significance level with a study involving 500 people. I mean, that's going to happen now and then, and I need a lot more data than that. But it's not hard to do bigger studies with more people. So it's not just 5%; it goes down to 1 in a million. You only have this 1 in a million if there's no effect, and that will change our mind quite a lot.
I don't know the exact figures, but I think they carried it on for decades, and they did thousands and thousands of trials with a whole variety of people, and they continued to get significant results. So we could just park that one and leave it as an in principle discussion of if the evidence looked like this, then it would convince you. I'm happy to go to park it there. I mean, there's lots of parapsychology research which I find is interesting. I guess what I'm thinking of discussions I've hosted on defining science and pseudoscience. And there's lots of arguments for pseudoscience that then make parapsychology science, because parapsychology research is held to a very high standard because of the amount of skeptics it's got. So they have to be really scrutinizing about how they collect their data and how they present it and organize it.
That's very interesting. I mean, I have a recent acquaintance who I'm very impressed by, and I'm just trying to make sure I've got his name. Who's
Rupert Sheldrake?
No, he's a psychologist, professor at Goldsmiths. He is in the parapsychology business. He started off as a parapsychologist. He's now pretty skeptical, but he's a real expert on the methodology. And I mean, here's an interesting thing that a lot of modern statistics was developed by people interested in parapsychology to try and put the question of, if I try and guess what you're thinking and I get it right 70 times in 100, how likely is that if I'm just guessing? And it's not obvious how likely that is if I'm guessing. You have to work out the statistics, and a lot of statistics was worked out by some parapsychologists trying to answer that question. He's
Chris French.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. I found something on YouTube from him.
And he's expert on, I mean, it's his main subject, how precise, how rigorous various parapsychology studies are. And he's not a out-and-out skeptic. I think he's pretty agnostic, actually. And
maybe I should interview him.
Yeah, I'd recommend that.
Yeah, I'll check him out. I've done a fair bit of research on the evidence for reincarnation, which comes in the form of children who report memories of past lives. I'm not sure if you've looked into that at all, but I could speak on it for a couple minutes.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about Chris French because we're on a train coming back from we had a symposium on religion in Oxford a few months ago, and he described a study they were doing that involved people trying to guess what was in somebody else's head, and they had kind of 5 categories, and you had to say, were they thinking about, I don't know, parties or something, and then there was the statistical question, and it's equivalent to if you've got 5 pairs of socks, all different colors, you muddle them in a drawer, you pull them out 2 at a time. How likely is it you'll get 1 match, 2 matches, 3 matches, 4 matches, 5 matches? And he said, oh, no, it's... and I said that, I mean, he had some idea about the numbers, and I said, no, that doesn't sound right to me. I mean, I have a background in mathematical statistics. And I then went and spent the whole weekend working out, to my satisfaction, what the probability of the options were. And I discovered that there's a whole mathematical little subdiscipline on the matching problem and how it converges asymptotically to some other.
It's much more complicated than you'd think, eh?
And it wasn't a trivial sum at all. So like I said, a lot of statistics is to do with, I mean, How likely is, if I'm guessing, I'll get 70 right and 100? How likely it is that if you're pulling out socks at random, you'll get 1, 2? I mean, it wasn't trivial at all. Anyway, sorry, I'm digressing.
This reminds me of the birthday thing, where how many people in a room before the chances are 50% that you'll have 2 people with the same birthday?
Yeah, that I can do fine. I know how to do
the
that.
number is like something like 23 or something. It's way smaller than people guess.
It's
quite a small number.
You have to turn it round. How likely it is you got 2 people that have different birthdays, and then you just iterate that and then it gets to a half after a while. But the matching problem, the 5 pairs of socks, was much harder than that one.
I thought it would be a similar kind of thing, because you're talking about matching. It'd be even simpler because you've only got 2 instead of 365.
It's very messy. It's very messy. You kind of have to do it by brute force. I mean, what are all the possibilities on the first one, and each of the possibilities on the first one, what are the possibilities on the second one? And there wasn't any very neat pattern. And then I Googled it, and it turned out, no, there wasn't a very neat pattern, but serious people worked very hard at it, and they kind of managed to find some kind of pattern using rather obscure mathematical functions. And I just solved it for 5 pairs of socks, but how do you generalize it to 10 pairs of socks and so on? So the birthday one is much simpler.
Right. Math is fascinating. I'm an electrician, and the math that's used for electrical engineering is geometry. And I just find it so weird that electricity, you map it out using geometry to figure out anyway. So we could move topic a little bit.
Philosophy of maths, philosophy of applied maths, another whole.
Oh yeah, just quickly on the parapsychology stuff. Like, my friend wrote a quite a good article, just presenting some of the evidence from parapsychology. Like there's one thing they did research on people who mediums. So people who have a relative or a friend, someone close to them who's passed on, and they speak to a medium, and often the medium can tell them intimate details about this person, or the person will be channeling the person and who's telling them intimate details. And they did studies on it where it was triple blinded, so the medium didn't know who they were doing the thing for. There was no way they could have researched ahead of time. They also gave the medium a false just the name of some random other person, so they could generate another random report, and they could give those 2 reports. They could they could give a report that was for someone else, and a report that was for this person. And the statistics of people who picked the report that was for their deceased relative was quite significant. Plus the significant details, which can be quite startling for these people. So this research is there. So what I'm getting to is, I imagine if you read this stuff and you looked into this evidence, you would say, if this is true, that's significant. I would be swayed by that, or I would have to look into it further. But I would also say that you would probably look at it and say, someone's being dishonest, someone's being naive, or it's a filtering problem. They didn't report all the times that the results didn't come out right.
Yeah, but I would urge, speak to Chris Finch. I mean, this is absolutely his area.
Actually, I'll get my friend that wrote that article to discuss with them. That would be interesting, because if he's skeptical, it's nice getting 2 people who disagree but respect each other and pushing back on one another. Because if they know their stuff, you can have quite a fruitful discussion.
Yeah.
So we could quickly shift gears and then wrap it up soon. On the discussion with the Kundalini, he made a point about free will. And he was making the case that on the physicalist worldview, where there's only matter, of course, you're not a reductive physicalist. You think we still have all the things that we take for granted about life, about humans existing and having emotions. And
that's because I am a reductive physicalist. I'm not an eliminative physicalist.
Okay, sorry, not an eliminative physicalist. Yeah. I just wanted to make that clear. But he was saying that on physicalism, you can't have free will, because free will assumes that there's an agent separate from an environment. But on physicalism, you can't distinguish the agent from the environment. You just have one system composed of matter interacting with itself.
But I still, look, I agree that to have free will, I need to distinguish an agent from the environment. So, I mean, a paradigm of non-free will is where my actions are being controlled by my environment rather than by me. I mean, look at the Penfield electrode studies. My arm's going up because somebody's stimulating an electrode. I mean, my arm's not going up because I'm chained down. I mean, those are paradigms where I'm not free to raise my arm. So I think free will is where my actions are determined by what's going on inside me, as opposed to what's going on in my environment. But I still think what's going on inside me is more physical stuff. So I can't remember exactly why I mean, if his argument is as you just articulated it, I mean,
just go with what I
think I have a ready answer.
So, I mean, it seems to me maybe we're getting into mereological nihilism, and perhaps you could comment on that if that's the case. But on physicalism, it would seem to me that the distinction of the agent, of me or you, willing to do something is arbitrary. Why not? Why draw the boundary of you there? It doesn't seem that physicalism would get us to that. That's just an arbitrary tack on to the theory.
Well, I mean, I don't think that the distinction between what's inside my skin and what's outside my skin is arbitrary. I mean, it's kind of constitutive of what it is to have organisms and human individuals and so on. And why I should rest free will on that is because it's precisely on my compatibilist, reductionist, you can have free will in a materialist world view. What it is for me to be acting freely is for my actions to depend on what's going on inside my brain rather than on something else. I mean, it depends. I mean, my actions are due to me making decisions on the basis of my aims and my projects. That's what it is for me to be acting freely.
I think the disagreement here is further back, and the point I just made and your response to, we're not really getting to the bottom of the disagreement between the two worldviews. Would you agree with that?
Sure. Look, let's try and look at this a bit more abstractly. Look, here's two ideas of free will. One is kind of minimal idea that my actions depend on my deliberations and my character and my beliefs and desires. That's a minimal idea, right? Here's a more highly charged idea of free will, that my actions depend on a self which transcends the rule of natural law, making a difference to how natural law plays out. It's not just, it includes my actions being based on my deliberations and my character and so on, but requires in addition that the impulse comes from outside the realm of natural materialistic law. And okay, clearly a materialist can have the first kind of free will, and pretty clearly a materialist can't have the second kind of free will. And now it looks like which is really free will becomes a terminological question.
Yeah. I would agree with that.
So the more substantial question, we shouldn't be saying, look, on your view, it's not real free will. And I'll say, well, it's, as Dennett says, it's all the free will worth wanting. We shouldn't be arguing about terminology. We should be arguing about, are there consequences that matter if we think of free will in the minimal materialist way rather than the more highly charged dualist way? I mean, that's That's the more interesting question. And the Hartley charge requires something more than just dualism. It requires that somehow this extra bit, the mindy bit, transcends the realm of natural law, that it's not governed by any kind of deterministic or even probabilistically predictive quantum mechanical laws, that somehow it's outside the realm of law. And some people argue Galen Strawson argues this, that idea of something which is directed yet outside the realm of law is kind of internally inconsistent. I mean, that's another line of thought. But so the real charge free will demands quite a lot. It demands some special kind of agent causality that's different from fitting in with the realm of natural law.
So I think the distinction you made there is helpful, and to say free will requires my worldview would be a kind of victory by definition, which doesn't actually establish anything other than that if you accept my definition of the word, it entails that the word only applies to my worldview, but it doesn't do more than that. But also, I want to point out, I find it quite interesting. I think your definition of free will is pretty much the same as mine, that I'm acting freely if it's my emotions, thoughts, desires, and intentions which are determining my choices. And if I just have the illusion of making these choices, but really it's a more lower level physical process that's making these choices, and I'm just along for the ride, that would obviously be a kind of determinism.
Yeah, but why do you say that you're not making the choices? Look, when I choose, I think about various options. Should I go to America next month? Should I retire? Should I go on holiday with my son and daughter? I mean, I think about the options, and I get information. I think about the various consequences. How much do I like them? I'm a person of a certain kind of character, and what I want is that the conclusion of my deliberation be a consequence, and a deterministic consequence is just fine of my powers of reasoning, what I care about, my character. I wouldn't want to end up with a choice that somehow was determined by a spin of a coin independently of those things. I don't want anything except those things, my aims, my character, and so on, to influence my choice. What would be so good about something else influencing your choice? That'd be terrible. So it seems to me that this deterministic, materialistic kind of what's going on is just what you want.
I was contrasting your view to epiphenomenalism. So if our conscious experience of reality is an epiphenomenon of a lower level physical going on, then I'd say we don't have free will. We're just along for the ride. It's atoms smashing together, which is determining what happens, not the intention.
If you were an epiphenomenalist dualist, I don't know why that's come in suddenly, but if one was an epiphenomenalist dualist, I'd still say you look. Let's not worry about the term. But if you're an epiphenomenalist, what would be so bad about your brain making a decision in the way I just described?
It wouldn't be our brain making decisions. It would be atoms smashing together. So like you have a chemical process going on in a tube. It's those chemical processes are determining what happens in the tube in the exact same way that the chemical processes in my brain are determining my thoughts and actions.
Yeah,
would be
but
the
why
view.
why have we bought an epiphenomenalist dualism? Nobody. I mean, you don't want to be an epiphenomenalist dualist. I don't want to be an epiphenomenalist dualist.
I'm just contrasting the different kinds of free will and saying if this is the case, that's determinism.
Yeah, but yeah,
And I think for many theists,
I don't see why you should be muddling up the debate we're having by bringing in the problems of epiphenomenalist dualist.
I'm just drawing some contrast to make clear the distinction of the different kinds of free will, or not what it would mean to not have free will. Also, I think for a lot of theists, the caricature they have in their head of physicalism is a kind of epiphenomenalism. David Bentley Hart has this witty phrase that the idea of the ghost in the machine versus the idea of the machine producing a ghost, both of them seem mystical. So that people at least have it in their heads, a lot of theists at least, that there's this contrast. Either you have the ghost in the machine, the homunculus, or the soul animating the body, or you have a machine miraculously producing a ghost.
Well, but it sounds like they're arguing against a straw opponent. They haven't really understood what people like me are thinking if they're arguing in that way. I'm not an epiphenomenalist.
Yeah, I'm willing to grant that. I was just commenting that I think our definitions of free will match up quite well. That if my thoughts, desires, and actions are determining things, because another definition you hear of free will is my choices are free if I could have done otherwise. And I find that definition of free will odd, because that seems to give winding the clock backwards causal power. If we could wind the clock back, then you would, and then you could act differently, all things being equal. It's like, well, if my intentions, thoughts, and desires and knowledge and everything I'm acting on were the same, of course I'm going to act the same way. My free choices are going to make the same choice, given all of the factors being the same, including my intentions. So
yeah, but I mean, they could have done differently. It's kind of not. It doesn't give you.
It's a weird definition, right? Did you agree that it gives the winding the clock backwards, that the clock going backwards becomes the causal factor, which is weird.
Why are we doing this? I mean, I could have done differently.
I'm just talking about different definitions of what free will is, and that's the common definition. If you couldn't have done otherwise, then you were determined.
Not in my circles, because there's ways of understanding. I mean, there's range of complications here. At first pass, there's ways of understanding could have done differently, which are consistent with determinism. Other ways of understanding could have done differently, which aren't consistent with determinism. So it really, bringing in this phrase doesn't help with the debate between the libertarian and the compatibilist. Also, they're Frankfurt cases, which make it look like they're cases where you couldn't have done differently, but intuitively you still were free. And so I prefer the formulation. My decision depends on my beliefs, desires, and character. And that's the good thought that this could have done differently is kind of pointing to on the compatibilist side. I mean, I could have done differently. I would have done differently if I'd had different beliefs and desires, if I'd had different lanes, if I had different character. So, I mean, but why don't put it in terms of could have done differently? That just muddies the water. Just put it in terms of my decisions as a result of what I believe and want.
So is the technical term for that agent causation?
No, agent causation is a technical term which is used in philosophical circles to mean a kind of uncaused cause that comes from outside the realm of natural law to be different. So it's a highly charged notion of free will that's incompatible with determinism that is described as agent causality.
So what's your definition of free will, on your view, called in the literature?
Compatibilist.
Okay.
It's compatibilist. So now I'm going to have to wrap up.
Cool. Yeah, we touched on a lot of stuff, and I think we could obviously have a lot of more back and forth on the metaphysics of physicalism versus dualism or a Vedanta view. But I think that was a very interesting discussion, and thank you very much for giving me some of your time.
Not at all. Thank you for having me on. That was fun. I enjoyed that. So.
Cool.